Welcome to MOTS, where we'll be applying the Manzer or mostly Thurlow skill of quantitative analysis of pop culture narrative through a binary system.
MOTS!
This podcast contains spoilers, mature content, and language. Viewer discretion is advised.
Good evening and welcome to MOTS. We are going through the Oscar-nominated films for the 2016 year.
17.
No, well, it's the 17 Oscars.
No,
but
this
this
is
is 16 movies.
Yeah,
Right.
it's like football season. It's the 2016.
Just cut and rephrase.
And I'm here with Ian Manzer,
Hello?
Scott Thurlow,
Good evening.
and Stephen Hermosi.
And hello.
And we just saw Lion, directed by Garth Davis and starring Dev Patel and Nicole Kidman. And Ian, would you like to give us a funny logline?
So I apologize in advance. But this is a film about third world problems becoming first world problems.
Yes, and I love that one. I also apologize, but I thought that was amazing. To be fair, and quick background, we came up with a couple throughout the film, but we settled on that one. We apologize if it's offensive, but I think it's funny and accurate. So
We also came up with Oliver Twist takes the Jarling Limited.
yeah,
So
maybe that will be less offensive. But either way, that's pretty much a good logline.
Okay, then. And Scott, would you like to give us a brief synopsis of the movie?
Sure. So a young Indian boy, about I believe 5, but he looks a little older in film. Regardless, in a downtrodden situation in India, trying to support his family, he gets lost on a train one evening. Within that, and gets adopted eventually by an Australian family, and then as he grows up in that culture and with them, decides to, when he's a grown man, is haunted by the fact that he lost his family and decides to eventually go find them, and does, and somewhat reconciles with them.
Okay, and now we'll go to Ian with the introduction.
okay, so as Scott was pointing out with the brief synopsis, we start with a young Indian boy. Probably he's actually 5, but it's probably around 8. He lives the life of a street urchin, even though he does have a family and he's an older brother who he kind of scavenges with. They end up going to a train yard, and he gets lost on a train that's going to Calcutta, which is 1,600
kilometers, I believe.
away. And he eventually, he gets lost in Calcutta. He can't find his way home. Goes through a lot of kind of trials and tribulations, and ends up in an orphanage where he gets adopted by an Australian couple. He goes there. Nicole Kidman,
Or is told he's going to be adopted.
yeah, well, he ends up getting adopted pretty quickly. Meets up with goes to Australia with a family, and eventually, a year later, another young Indian boy ends up joining the family, and that's basically the introduction.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that a lot of strong points of the introduction I'm going to talk about in style.
I think we all agree on that, yeah. Good.
But as far as the story goes, I think a lot of it comes back in the end, right? So, like, the introduction I thought was good, but I wasn't blown away by it. It becomes more important later, I think.
Well, what I found interesting about it was you're kind of getting a deep look into the underbelly of this culture here. You have a young boy who's lost. And, he's Indian, but he's in a area that's primarily Bengali. He can't speak the language.
Or that's where he ends up. Yeah.
And he, everywhere you go, basically there's one part he's sleeping in a train station with a bunch of other street urchins, and a bunch of people come running in, capturing all the orphans. Mm-hmm. He meets this this woman who seems like a safe haven, will take care of him, but she is about to sell him to this really skeevy guy who I don't know what his intent was, but the main character, Saru.
Saru smartly runs away.
Yeah. And
he bravely ran away.
no matter what happens, like he is lost in a strange world here, and
Yeah.
I thought it was very effective. Like the kind of the alienation that I felt as an audience member to his alienation being in this area.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, I don't have much more to add, but I thought it was a quite well done intro in the sense that you're introduced to their life pretty quickly and what it's like, what the situation is, and then also pretty quickly enough, then he gets separated from his family and is pretty much lost in a strange land, a different part of his country, and has to deal with it.
The difficulty with describing the introduction with great details, a lot of it's told visually. I mean, we're going to get into style, but the cinematography is just outstanding, and it really follows him. It's a very visual play. There is some dialogue, but it's usually just him calling out for help. But there are certain things, and this is going to be important later on, is the beginning when it starts off, he and his brother are stealing coal from a train, and they trade the coal for 2 small bags of milk. And while they're getting the milk, he sees the dessert jalebi, which is basically fried sugar with sugar syrup in the middle of it. And that's actually going to become a plot point as we segue into, if anybody has anything else before we go to the body.
No, not much. I just think that this was a very. I just want to say this. I may give the intro a 0 because despite the fact that I think that it was a very good setup as far as things that were going to happen later, it sets up a lot of plot points later. It sets up a lot of just little touchstones for later in the movie. Not much happened, and I was kind of waiting for the point where there was like human interaction, like more a stronger interaction between people the entire time.
Well, I actually wholeheartedly disagree with you that I think this is the most interesting part of the film, and because of there not much character interaction happened on, but it's the idea of him being a stranger in a strange land, and it to me it was like, this is going to sound condescending to the film, and it's not meant to be, but I think this is the way. It almost felt like watching a nature documentary of seeing events in a world which I'm outside of, and considering a lot of the bestial nature of like how people treated each other in this situation. I thought it was very, very strong on that aspect.
I agree to that, the last tail end of what you said, and we'll probably speak about later, but I think it was an arresting enough introduction that, a small child in India in a poor situation, getting separated from his family, lost, bereft of any guidance, I think is a pretty arresting introduction.
I mean,
Perhaps you're right.
It's a road movie of a 5-year-old going from a rural village to another part of the country, that's got a completely different culture aside from being like a major city. I mean, it is very much a road movie in that respect. So that's, having this visual evolution does not, make your claims of it kind of. The comparison you have of a nature documentary is apt in its own way.
Just real quick, we mentioned the alternate logline as Oliver Twist, it's almost like a very dark Tom Sawyer in a kind of sense, and it got me. So I'm gonna give it a solid 1, if nothing else, at the end of the day.
I'm definitely giving it a 1. It was exquisite.
I'm reevaluating a bit based on what you guys have just said, and perhaps you're right. I did like the intro of this, but I was kind of my.
I get you're saying it wasn't mind blowing.
What I'm saying is what my point was really is that I was kind of waiting for the movie to start in the first part.
You're entitled to your informed opinion. So if you disagree, that
sure,
is
sure, I agree with that. But
and
however,
if you change your mind, you can always change your score.
You guys may have convinced me to give it a 1. I'm kind of teetering on the brink of it right here.
Sometimes it happens. So,
you know what? Just because I don't want to drag this out, I'm going to give it a score right now. I'm going to say I will give the intro a 1 based on the strength of how I felt about it later.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And since we're on with Steve-O, you can go to the body, Jalebi.
All right. So the body begins when things go to 20 years later. the first scene of the body is Dev Patel swimming in the ocean, and then it kind of quickly goes to him talking about how he's going to this hotel management program. He has this last scene where his brother doesn't show up, and then he kind of goes away. Or he actually goes to see his brother, talks to him briefly, and then he goes away. He meets some friends at this new program, including a woman who becomes his girlfriend, who he kind of talks. He sees what's the name of the dessert?
The jalebi.
Jalebi. That he sees.
They happen to be serving Indian
he
food
sees that at there.
the
Yeah,
party.
He's at a party. He sees it, and this kind of spurs his memory. He starts talking to his friends about what happened to him, and then he decides he kind of is almost forced to, like, by his own memories of the thing, almost forced to start looking into what happened to his mother. And this is kind of the main thread of the rest of the movie, where throughout everything that's going on in his life, he's looking for his mother and
or his home,
and his family and his home. Eventually, after several things, he becomes completely engrossed in it, and eventually he finds his homeland and decides, or his hometown, and decides to go back there, and that's kind of the end of the body. So there are a lot of things in there that we can talk about for sure, but that's kind of the gist.
Yeah, you're right. And via Google Maps, so again, Google Maps saves everybody. But sure, you're right. Like they say to him, like, hey, listen, now that once he lays bare like what his history and the situation, they say you have the technology. If you really want to, there's a way to figure it out. If you want to go through with it. And yeah, so like, yeah, of course, like he's starting a new life, and he's got his job, and he strikes a relationship with Lucy, is the girl who's in his class and so forth. And he's sort of like, to me, like I took it as every now and again he'd like go on to Google Maps and like maybe like scroll around here and there. It seems
like from what his girlfriend said that he was constantly doing it, because she said that she couldn't get him off the couch, and then they eventually break up over it. That they're always in separate rooms.
I don't know if I got that out of that.
No, that's totally.
Really? Okay. I mean, I guess I believe you guys. That sort of slipped me by. Goody.
That's the thing, is if you weren't paying attention to the one line that said that they were breaking up, you would have missed that plot point entirely. And they sold, like, and this is where I'm coming into a gripe with this film. And harkening back to my funny log line here, they built up so much tension with the opening introduction, with him being in Calcutta and all the suffering he faced. Now they have to fill the rest of the movie with tension that, for the most part, doesn't exist. Now, granted, I don't want to detract from this guy's life story and the troubles he's facing, but they're legitimately first-world problems at this point. Oh, this beautiful woman who is... this beautiful woman who is... who's in love with me and pushing me to go find my family. I can't be with her because it's challenging it's causing me to have an existential crisis. I'm like, look, man, or he goes, I can't be with Nicole Kidman, who's been this caring mother who's shown me nothing but love, because I don't want to hurt her with the fact that I'm considering who I am. I was getting very, very irked and aggrieved at this character for being like, come on, man, just do it. Don't make everyone else suffer because you are going through a midlife crisis, even though you're only 28 or so.
I agree with most of that. And like, not that you convinced me, but I had somewhat of that in the back of my mind. So it's almost as if it's like this, right? Yes, that's like his struggle. However, they didn't like, the tension thing was a good point. They like, because it's a dramatic film, they needed tension. And yeah, whether or not, like, however true or not it was to the actual story, the fact of the matter is, this is a film. So, like, it's almost like it was padded with unnecessary tension, I think. And you're right. Like, in fact, as I just admitted, I sort of missed that line. Or, like, retroactively, I got it. But at the time, it sort of, like just blew by me. I was like, what? So, I know I sometimes overuse this term, but the body itself of this film, I think, was more meandering than was needed. So while I enjoyed it, yes, I think it was the weakest part of the 3 acts that encompass the intro, conclusion, body. So
I don't know if I dislike the body as much as you two did,
Mm.
but what I will say is it had more in common, since we're talking about Oscar films, it had more in common with the body of Hacksaw Ridge than it did with Hidden Figures.
no, I like that. I like that, Steve. I agree.
I thought that
Now that you mention it.
I thought that that speaking of those two films, I thought that the body of Hidden Figures was very tightly written. I thought that the body of Hacksaw Ridge was very loosely written, and they just kind of threw things in because they had happened in real life.
Mhm.
Whereas Hidden Figures, they put things into it because they made sense to the story. Or at least if they happened in real life and they needed to throw them in, they tied them into the story. Whereas I thought there were certain parts of this movie that seemed kind of like they didn't need to be there. Specifically, like certain scenes with his girlfriend. I was kind of thrown off by the fact that that whole party scene in the beginning, he seemed to have made a lot of friends who were pushing him to go and figure out what his life was about, and then they never reappeared, and they had nothing to do with the movie after that. And like that, like those could have been people that were part of his life, you know, that were part of this film. Maybe they weren't actually in real life, and that's why they did that. But it just seemed like kind of a throwaway section that was only there to propel him on his journey, and not there because it was part of his life.
It felt like he didn't have any real relationships in here, except for that. The primary purpose of this film was not to describe any of the relationships he had in his life, but more so about his journey.
Right.
Exactly.
When we're doing that one old Neophytes in Narratology, where we're talking about the idea that everything when you reflect upon a life, it goes back to saying that everything in your life has leads up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems that this is the way that is frameworked. Everything in his life is leading up to him going back to India for that.
Right.
I mean, I agree with you. They definitely, you know, for different reasons, had to play up the drama a bit. But and I agree with you. To me, the body was basically to get me to the end. I was really engrossed with this journey. The whole movie is basically a road film, and I thought it was very well done. But I did buy him isolating himself because he had 25 years of guilt fall on him, you know, like, you know, opening up a closet and having all this fall on him. So he had to process it, and he didn't know what to make of it. So, you know, I can see that, you know, he may have isolated himself, you know, and he's had so much guilt, and he feels like he hurt and betrayed his old family. So he, you know, he was afraid. He didn't know what to do not to hurt anybody. So I could see where his isolation came from. Like, he kind of panicked himself into isolation.
I don't know if it was guilt per se, but certainly he felt haunted by the fact that his experiences, like what happened to him. I just felt like, we say this often, but it's not a mark against the film. I just thought the body was the weakest point. So on average, I think I might give it a soft 0 just because of that. I didn't think it was poorly done or mishandled in any way. It just was the least interesting part of this film to me.
I will be stronger with that, and I think that it was mishandled. I think you could have trimmed it, made it a tighter film.
All right, maybe,
and
sure.
There were a couple scenes in there which we'll go into dialogue with, which didn't quite work for me, and mostly taking place in the body. So I'm going to give it a very strong 0.
I'll meet you midway, but I'll give it a soft 0, but nevertheless a 0.
I'm giving it a 1. I thought two of my favorite directors are Jim Jarmusch and Ingmar Bergman. So Extended Psychosis from Ingmar Bergman, you know, I can get, and a lot of the use of color and texture in the different environments, and how when his past was coming back to him, how they juxtapose the two. And yeah, it's going to get into style, which is really hard to separate from, you know, the things.
The movie as a whole, sure, I get it.
But it did contribute to the narrative enough for me.
Sure.
That, like, the melodramatic parts, all right, they were definitely weak in the body, but I didn't think it was not enough to, you know, for me not to give it a 1.
Yeah, I'm gonna give this a soft 1 as well. I didn't. It was the weakest part of the movie, I guess, stylistically and
narratively,
perhaps narratively, but it did get me. It did get me from point A to point B fairly well. I didn't lose interest in this movie at any point, and I have to give it credit for that.
All right, I got nothing else to say.
All right, then we're on to Scott with conclusion. How does this thing end?
And now I do have things to say. So yeah, so as you said, like he eventually uses the technology available via Google Maps. Shout out to Google Maps. And like he's sort of like, it's actually, I like this part because he's sort of like almost lethargically scrolling through the map of India, or like the radius. He has like sort of a mapped out area in which like the train station and so forth, as we referenced earlier. His friends were like, oh, you can reference the speed of trains and how many stations, whatever, even though there are many. So either way, he like sort of like realizes he stumbles upon like an image via the Google satellite image that triggers a memory in his mind, and now he realizes like, oh, I believe this is the right one. And as he keeps tracking it closer and closer, he realizes in fact he's found his town, he's found his home. And decides to, he tells his girlfriend Lucy and he tells his parents that he's going to go back there and attempt to at least find and reunite with whatever may be left, and does so. And indeed, he goes to where he remembers his old house being. I believe it's a quick goat farm, like an elderly-ish couple lives there, but he tells them who he is and what he's doing there, and they quickly bring him to his mother, Kami, I believe? Kamla is her name. So yeah, she's still living there. And they are reunited with each other, and she tells him that she's been searching. He looked for him every day since he left, and here he is. And his sister is there, and his brother. So this is quite contained in this, but his brother is not there. He is passed on. He had died earlier, at some of the previous point. But at least he finds closure. He's finally found his family. The demons have been haunting him. I believe one of the lines, in fact, Saru says, "There are no more loose ends. I'm now content," basically, and I finally found them, and I'm glad to have done so. Now I can pretty much go on with my life, and the movie pretty much ends with like sort of a flashback dream sequence, him walking down the train tracks and seeing himself as a young boy with his brother, and then credits roll. Yeah. So I felt satisfied by it. I think it was very good narrative closure. I think it was, if not strong, like very solid. I'm probably going to give it a standard solid 1. I certainly think it was stronger than the body. And I think, again, like I said, it closed all narrative threads, so I was very satisfied by it.
Yeah, but what they did at the very end, the epilogue, per se, after the train track thing, is they show the real-life photographs of him growing up.
I was going to say that for style, but I get it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because I think Ian and I both agree that, I mean, for me, it was an emotional movie, and I was very moved during it, but when you see the real-life video of him with his two moms meeting for the first time. That definitely was just...
It was icing on the cake, if you will. Sure.
This movie had lost my interest by this point, but I had thought it was like it's a nice ending. I mean, I'm not gonna... It's a nice story. It was an okay movie about it, and like it had a narrative closure, as you mentioned, and
that's become my scale for this question, so...
It's going to get a 1 because it handled all its business well.
Yeah.
And that might not be a glowing review, but it is what it is.
I'll just point out one final thing. I like it when we agree that the movie has any work has no loose threads, and it lampshades itself that there is no more loose threads.
Yeah,
so.
Says right in the movie that it is no loose. But yeah, the conclusion I thought was the strongest part of this movie, to be honest. And that's not to say that that I thought any part of this movie was really weak, but the conclusion tied everything up, and in fact brought everything back around to the intro, which I thought was one of the very strongest parts of this. They did a very good visual tying things back in with the intro of this movie, and on top of that, it was just it's just an emotional ending to the film. He meets up with his mother again, who he hasn't seen in 20 2 years or
25
whatever.
or whatever.
And
Sure.
yeah, and not only do they have that in the movie, but they also have the actual video, as you mentioned, to really drive the point home.
Yep.
So I don't have much more to say about it. I really like the conclusion. It's going to get a 1 for me.
So that's ones all around.
Yep. Okay, and it's on to me with themes, and it's can you go home again? You can go home again. Finding out what family is. There's a lot of themes, but they're all really related to different kinds of connections. I mean, whether it's physical difference and being lost, and it's like he was struggling so hard to survive at the beginning that even though he was looking for his home, calling out for his brother and mom, that he was so focused on surviving, he didn't allow himself to be homesick at like any time. So it's all the themes of the movies to me are connections, whether they're, distance, whether they're familial, whether they're internal. And I don't know. I'm just gonna give my score now. I'm gonna give it a 1. So I'll move it over to you guys.
No, I agree with most of that, and I would also add the random mishaps of life, perhaps.
Yeah.
As I often point out. But no, I think you're right. I think it's like because of the nature of the film or the nature of the story, and as portrayed in the film, that yes, I know Ian might speak upon the "you can't go home again" thing, which I think is certainly at least in there as a minor theme.
Oh, I've got a better one.
All right. But either way, like, I think it was well portrayed, and yeah, I enjoy story that encompasses those kinds of things and those kinds of elements, and I think it was portrayed well in this one.
So it's an interesting study of nature versus nurture, which you have
good one.
two
Okay.
young boys from India who get taken to Australia and put into an upper middle class existence, and one becomes a self-destructive, emotionally scarred individual, while the other, Dev Patel, becomes a prissy little white boy who is very upset about, like, oh, my life is so difficult. And granted, I don't mean anything, like, I don't mean to attack.
Not mean to disparage anything about this.
But it is really, like, he's fighting through all of these kind of, like, aspects that I hate my friends for. Like, when they complain about how miserable their lives are. Like, Dev Patel's character has a really good life. And yeah, I understand that, but, like, everyone has these, like, issues in their lives. I don't know, like the themes... The more important theme, I think, and more interesting one is actually Nicole Kidman's character, with the idea of having to deal with adopted children and your relationship with them, and
choosing
also
to deal with.
Yeah, she chose to, and like the idea of like motherhood when you aren't like directly biologically related, and like there was a lot of kind of like subtle messaging here for, although at times not subtle at all, but for the most
it's
part,
a sine
I think
wave,
was handled.
but sure.
Handled in a very complicated and nuanced fashion, the idea of like having to take care of kids from that aren't your own, from a society completely outside of yours, and in a way, like, you don't know, when you're basically gambling within with birth in general, but with also an adoption.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I think that there's kind of this fish out of water theme between Nicole Kidman and Saru, that and what's his brother's name? Mantosh?
Yes.
His brother's name. That they all kind of deal with in this film. They're all kind of outside of their comfort zone. And despite the fact that, Saru has been raised since he was 6 or 7 in this, I guess seemingly somewhat well-to-do,
comfortable life,
or at least middle-class Australian family, he's got a lot of baggage that comes with him, same as his brother, Mantosh, who, they both deal with it in their own ways, and the fact that it hasn't manifested in, like, just complete anger issues with him doesn't mean that he hasn't felt the same weight, I guess, of his childhood, how he was raised initially before he came to Australia, that his brother has.
Granted, I would like to agree with you on that point, except I don't think the film... yeah, they did the kind of flashback and nightmare aspect to it, but
doesn't explore it as much.
Perhaps as an indictment of the director, perhaps as an indictment of Dev Patel, perhaps as an indictment of the screenwriter. But I don't think it came across as anything but angst. And
Maybe.
it's my personal opinion, but like that's what I felt watching this, and I was rolling my eyes at a lot of it, especially towards the like midway through the body.
No, I get that, and I think maybe we'll talk about that in later questions, but I think the nature versus nurture thing, is a very good point. And finding yourself, sure, like, even given these extraordinary circumstances, perhaps that adds, like, a layer to it. But I think that's still, like, a quality theme to address, so if I give 50% credit or more to both, I'm going to give it a 1 at the end of the day for myself, and that's pretty much all I can say for my analysis.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm going to probably give it a 1.
And the other thing is, all right, I thought Nicole Kidman's journey, what you said before, was interesting because he didn't want to hurt her because he was afraid that, okay, here's your mom who's, loved you and taken care of you. He felt like he was going to betray her, saying that, like, look, I'm looking for my birth mother. Like, he was somehow going to betray her. And she turned around and was just like, because he's just like, I'm sorry you couldn't have kids. And she's just like, oh, we can have kids. We chose you. We decided you were what we wanted. You were, and I thought that was a really important issue.
Because she had a vision when she was a child where she saw
But that's not the
That'll come
point,
into
though.
play
That
later.
is
I think it's important.
legitimately the end result of the point you just made, which I think, in a sense, again, the more I'm getting worked up about this, which I apologize for, but nonetheless, it's just that the fringes of this start to really like annoy me on what could be very strong points they're trying to make.
I think you almost got me, but I still think I'm going to give it a solid 1. But you're right, like it's closer than I thought it was originally in my own mind. So that's a good point, though.
Yeah,
I'm actually going to give it a soft 1 because
right.
I think that there's enough there that's interesting to talk about, but I don't think it's necessarily the
as
strongest.
in depth as perhaps
It
people
intended
think.
Chris,
to be.
what was your score?
Mine's a 1.
All right.
And Ian, would you like to talk about the antagonist?
Why are you giving me that look, Steve?
I think we've already talked about the antagonist.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Scott, I'm going to bunt this one to you.
All right. So, yes, I'm sorry, my default answer is the random mishaps of fortune, if you will. And, like, while that is almost always going to be the case for anybody, I think in this instance, being given that it was based on a true story, yeah, it's a harsher thing than almost anyone have to deal with. And perhaps we don't know for sure, unless you're that person, how it's going to affect you. So, like I said, he was haunted by, like, he grew up to be, and/or was raised, going back to the nature nurture thing, like, a pretty solid, like, person, and decided, like, he was going forward with his life. He was learning. He was going to courses, as we mentioned. It's just that at the end of the day, he also was haunted by the fact that he was indeed, torn away from his original family, pretty much. And that still affected him. It affected his relationships eventually with Lucy and so forth, and his mother. So I think that's always going, like, I'm sorry, I apologize. Also, I don't. That I think that kind of thing is always going to be effective as an antagonist to anybody, to a person of any sorts, regardless of what it is.
I somewhat agree with you that is the antagonist, Scott. However, this is the part that I'm going to, I guess, take on Ian's mantle from the previous question, in that I think that first world problems is the antagonist of this. Really, like, it's I
like that too.
I
never
never felt like Saru was really antagonized throughout this. I thought that he was driven, but there wasn't anything that really haunted him. And I think that his relationship with his parents could have been a good antagonist. I think that his relationship with his brother could have been a good antagonist, but I don't think any of that was explored, and I think that it should have been. And the fact that it wasn't is going to make me give this a bad score.
Okay, so I'm going to say this one thing. I'm going to apologize in advance, and then I'm going to shut up.
Stop apologizing.
Cross envy. My suffering is greater than your suffering. I cannot be happy until my suffering is the best suffering around. And that is first world problems 100% right there. So I'm going to shut up now. So,
Like, you guys are right. Like, that's such a good point. Both of you just like made a.
I don't think he's trying to like
I get it. It's like even
make his
a
suffering
Christ complex or
better
anything
than
like that.
anybody else's suffering. But what I would say is that I don't think that I ever worried about this character
Right.
or like
You're
gave a
saying,
shit
Steve-O,
about the things that were antagonizing him.
If I may rephrase, you're saying you didn't feel he was antagonized enough by any one thing or any
No.
a combination of things.
Right.
I completely get that. It's just that, like, you guys, you might have swayed me, in fact. It's difficult. So if I talk it out real quick. Originally, I was tempted to. All right, Chris, maybe you can.
Yeah,
convince me.
because you and I always usually agree on the, fate or the universe somehow. But I've been giving this a lot of thought, and I thought, a lot of times when we talk about that is usually, if it's not a physical antagonist, and I often
Some nebulous entity.
Yeah,
is-
I always say that an antagonist doesn't have to be a villain or anything. It just it
Sure.
can be a catalyst. But I don't feel like there was a flow-through catalyst. I mean, there were separate, disparate elements. Eventually, it comes to his own. I mean, there's a lot of it, but I think those would fit more into themes. I think the antagonism has to do with wherever he is in his journey. So if we are going to talk about antagonists, I have to probably give this one a 0.
I think you gentlemen have convinced me. Traditionally, I would have for what I said, but I think given in light of your arguments, I am going to switch to a 0.
But this does not
Now-
take away from any of the antagonists
Sure.
or catalysts
I'm not
in
saying
his
that you're right.
journey.
I'm not saying it's marked
But
against the
yeah,
film.
but as for this score, the way we score it, yeah,
I just
would
think
be
it
a
wasn't
0.
enough.
Yeah.
You're right, based
Now-
on what you guys.
Now,
have said.
Ian, I've learned to not take any of your scores for granted.
Oh, I'm giving this one a 0.
All right, just making sure.
Yeah, for most of the reasons you gave, which I didn't feel that.
I think he
was
built
under
upon
any
your
duress.
reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
What's
I
it-
mean, he
you
was
guys
certainly
got
under
me.
duress when he was a child, but that never translated into a bigger antagonist. That I think that the things that haunted him later in life should have had more to do with what he was when he was
With
a
that,
kid,
mm.
but the movie didn't make it that way.
I think that's
So,
pretty well said. So yeah,
Zeros all across the
I'll give
board.
it a soft
sounds
0
like
maybe,
that
but nevertheless, I think you guys got me on that one. So
Yeah. All right, and Steven, since we're to you, would you like to talk about the protagonist? Is there a protagonist in this movie?
What? Yes.
yeah, it's first world problems.
Saru is clearly the protagonist. I think that both actors who played him did a good job of playing him. Perhaps in some people's opinions, he didn't have much to work against, to protagonize against, if I can create a word.
I do like that phrase. Yes.
In the second half, but I thought that both I don't know what the actor's name was, but the child when he was a kid, I thought that kid did a great job,
Sunny Pawar?
Sonny Pawar, and I thought that Dev Patel did a great job
May I just interrupt you?
acting as him as well.
I like Dev Patel. I find him a charming lead.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the little kid outacted him in this.
Without question.
You
Perhaps I don't know
Son
if I
of a
would
bitch.
say he outacted him, but he had certainly a more exciting role, I would say.
Well, actually, it was more interesting because all of us as adults, having been in relationships, whatever parental issues you have, you can kind of like, it's kind of like Dev Patel's telling another version of, nothing that we would understand firsthand, but the relationships, the struggles. Whereas, when he was little, not only is the actor like awesome, he's also adorable. But it was just really interesting to see things from his perspective, like how much more aware of the world around him and how much more adaptable he was, even to people living in even people living in Calcutta. And so I thought his journey was more interesting just by the nature of the journey, much less. So it's not really a reflection on Dev Patel or Sunny Pawar. This is just a matter of like who, at what point in his life was the perspective, more interesting.
I have two quick things to say. Yes, I think Dev Patel did a pretty fantastic job of portraying Saru. And yes, as perhaps listeners know, and you gentlemen certainly do, I'm not particularly the biggest fan of child actors, but I will give Sunny Pawa a lot of credit because, in fact, I thought he did a very great job at portraying like a lost little boy, a lost child in the situation that he was. And I almost forgot that he was a child actor, and that's the best praise I can say. So, while we sort of like bizarrely just said like he wasn't fighting against much, I still was invested, and it was very believable, a very organic and a natural portrayal of the character that I was,
Sunny's portrayal of
Saru
I was under constant fear for. But that was only 1/3 of the movie. So
I get it.
But nonetheless, I'm going to give him a 1, Sonny in particular, for this one look that he gives when he's in the orphanage and he turns back and asks, "Did you try everything to find like my family?" There's no, we tried everything. And he just gives this look of like acceptance, resignation. Like it is one of the most complex looks I've seen an actor give. In a very, very long time, and it was from a
child
actor.
Yeah.
You're right. You pointed that out during the film, and I agree with that. So that's probably why I'll give it a 1 too.
It was very good.
All right. So it's definitely wins all around. Want to go, Scott?
I mean, well, so it's secondary to me. I'll just put out a broad thing. I think they collectively. This seems to be a running aspect through at least this Oscar season. I can't really necessarily pick one per se out. Maybe you guys can. Maybe like you'll talk about that one you like the most.
Who are we counting as secondary characters?
Well,
are you going to count?
We'll tell you. It's going to be his family. So Joe and Sue, his brother Mantesh, also Saru's brother when he's young, and his adopted brother, and his girlfriend Lucy. So like they're all fine. Like they all fleshed out his world that he was sort of transposed into, and who he interacted with, and even like the other college friends and so forth. So while it was all like organically, again, believable, none of them were necessarily stand out to me, but I think I might give them a collective soft one at the end of the day. I don't know. That's my initial impression. What do you guys think?
I really liked his brother, his real brother, Gudu. Or I don't remember how you pronounce his name. I think it's Gudu, or
I believe it is Gudu.
Gudu, or yeah. But he was, for the short time that he was on film, I liked him a lot. I thought he did a great job playing a big brother, and just like kind of the role that a big brother has. And when he leaves Saru in the train station, you can see his kind of like hesitation, but he knows that he has to go make money, and like there's this whole thing. And
sure, he's torn about it.
Finding out at the end of the movie that he died that night,
spoiler.
Kind of, you find at the end of the movie that he died that night. Spoiler. Kind of gives hit me. I was like, oh shit, like that sucks.
So I didn't know who the main character was among the two. Oh, at the start of the film, I actually thought Guru was going to be the main character, and like this traumatic experience of leaving, like his brother would get lost, and he would go on to like wander after him. Then it became clear very shortly that it was Saru, but the fact that I felt he was the protagonist for quite a while, and the strength that he portrayed, I have to give him credit for that.
Okay.
Yeah, I went into this movie thinking that I mean, I knew it was the younger brother. But to me, everybody who wasn't Saru, whether an adult or a child, is a supporting character. And I think that Lucy did seem more like, was an exaggeration of the girlfriend he had at the time. So she really was kind of like just a barometer as to where he was emotionally. But as legitimate supporting characters, his brother, Definitely his parents, his adopted brother. I mean, on the strength of those characters, definitely I'm giving it a 1.
I was just gonna say I also give a lot of credit to Montage, his adopted brother. I can think of him in 2 scenes really, and in both of those scenes, he kind of steals the show by being the absent brother. You know, the fact that he's there or the fact that he's in the scene is the point of that scene. And he does a very good job of playing that absent brother and just kind of making it clear why he is the absent brother. And I think that on the strength of him and on the strength of his 2 brothers, really, I'm gonna give this a 1.
No, it's well pointed out. Like, perhaps I will, given that your argument, Steve-O, they deserve more credit than I originally was going to give to them. But again, I just think collectively they all deserve a 1. I just can't necessarily point out per se, even in light of that I choose one over the other. But they all did a very good job. The supporting cast did a solid job, great job, in fact.
And what I liked is, and it wasn't really explored so much growing up, but it was made mention that he was always protective of what's his adopted brother's name?
Montage.
Montage. And the way he is reflecting on the way his blood brother growing up treated him. So he was, very protective of his younger brother.
Sure.
But as an adult, he started getting angry at his brother. But the last reconciliation, he went back and watched his brother sleep, and was just like,
creepy.
No, it was kind of like, I have been neglecting you as your older brother.
Yeah. Sure, it was meant to be touching.
It was a nice little juxtaposition, so to speak. I really kind of wish they'd explored their relationship a little more.
Sure.
I think Nicole Kidman did a very good job, aside from one scene. But that wasn't her fault. That was the dialogue.
I think we'll talk about that in a second.
She did. I think she carried a lot of the emotional weight of this film.
Mm-hmm.
I like the actress who played his girlfriend Lucy.
Except for one scene.
But no, except I don't like the way she was written.
Okay.
Again, as you pointed out, she wasn't there as a character. She was there as a moral barometer for Dev Patel.
Yeah, and reading up on it. Sorry, go on.
And then, and mostly, like, all of the characters when he was young, and also when he returns to, I think it's, it worked out. I especially just want to point out the really creepy guy, Rama. Which was perhaps my favorite character in the film, just because,
of course,
like, he had all of his subtitles were white subtitles
on his white shirt.
Well, that's style, obviously, right. But sure.
But
collectively, I'll give him a solid 1.
Yeah, I agree.
At least.
Yeah, I agree. All right, and it's to me with dialogue, and I always say if dialogue propels a story, isn't cringeworthy, doesn't have any missteps. I make it, I always give it a 1. This one, the dialogue was, I don't know, it was very natural growing up. I mean, on the strength of when they were as adults, it's the more melodramatic parts we were talking about, it just, a lot of it did kind of seem by the numbers, because this movie up until now was such a visual movie that the dialogue, with him growing up was more natural. It was kind of like as a child, and when they got up, they kind of took a little more artistic license with it. So I'm kind of on the fence with this one.
Me too, but I think I'm going to come down on the 0 end of the scale, only because by and large, it was, again, serviceable, like fine, like pretty well written, in fact, and definitely well acted. Except there were 2 or 3, and I think Ian's going to expand upon this. I'll leave it to him when I'm done. 2 or 3, like, crux scenes in which it was supposed to be, like, heavily, like, the exchange should have been more meaningful than it was, and the dialogue was the reason why it wasn't. So that's why I don't know if I'm going to give this a 1.
I think I figured it out. It was the difference between natural dialogue versus scripted dialogue.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Like, it was natural, and then the adult, he was definitely scripted.
Well, there were certainly scripted parts in this, but there's also parts where the screenwriter left his script out, and his 13-year-old son, who wants to be a writer, wrote what he thought was inspiring works.
Maybe,
but
it certainly felt
just
like that. Yeah,
it's
yeah.
excruciating to listen to. That it brought me out of the movie. That took a long time for me to bring me back into the film. There's one scene actually, which was between Dev Patel and his girlfriend in this. Talking brought me. I went on my phone, and I actually had to say to everyone while we were watching this, like, this was a terrible scene. And Steven was pointing out, oh well, at least it made up for a good scene after it. But I wasn't paying attention any longer. Like there's that bad of scenes that it just literally tore me out. And there's one scene in particular where Nicole Kidman is talking about how she had this vision of adopting brown children, like she was Angelina Jolie.
I think one of us said that.
And it was just such an awful, like, it started out as a kind of an emotional, like, explanation for why she felt she needed to adopt, and became like a total, I felt, caricature.
It was
almost.
A caricature of itself. Yeah.
So
I agree. So Chris said no. You said no cringe. Like those moments were extremely cringe to me, and I definitely noticed them.
But
so that's all I can
saying,
say. Like,
you know,
it's tough. It's all tough only because everything else beyond, like, and outside of those was fine, but because they were so noticeable and so, like, I guess over the top, like, you know, here's my Oscar, like, speech, except it was so obviously that, and the words themselves, while acted pretty well, I just couldn't get into it, and it brought me out of the film, like as you said.
I have to agree with you guys. There were good to very good moments of dialogue in this movie, and most of it was pretty solid. There were several moments of, and the worst part about these moments, these moments that took me out of the film, in the same way as you guys, was that most of them started out pretty good. Yeah, and you were like, oh, I'm ready for a good, like, I'm ready for a good monologue.
I'm sorry, it was such a slow roll, right?
Yeah, I'm ready for a good monologue or a good dialogue here. And then they just went like completely into left field, and you're like, what the? No, man, no. Just nail this scene. That's what you have to do. That's what you have to do. And they didn't. And it was frustrating.
Yes.
But like,
yes,
you know,
well
like,
said.
To that extent, I think I have to give it. I think I have to err on the side of 0 because there were these moments of like possible, you know, brilliance going in, and they just kind of flubbed it.
They
They just kind of fumbled the
once
ball.
they started writing the dialogue, that's when it fell short.
Yeah.
But I was actually I wanted to come back to something I had said in themes when you were talking about the vision. After I said that she chose to adopt these, this is what they had in mind. I wasn't taking off points for the vision monologue then. I was transferring those points now because it was so touching.
You have to,
and then when she started the vision, whether or not it was true or not, I'm not taking anything away from that. But by the same token, dialogue as a scene, it was pretty awful.
The way it came off was so stilted.
So what are you giving it, Chris?
I have to give it a 0.
All right, so that's 0s all around for
soft/solid 0.
Because the first third of the film, it looked like it was a documentary. They're following this kid, and then all of a sudden, when he's an adult, it was a very good movie. But the dialogue in that movie just wasn't well handled.
Exactly.
Okay, so Ian, with style.
All right. Well, I'm going to just say a couple brief things and then pass it along to people who know better. I think the style was some of the strongest parts of this movie, if not the strongest part. The cinematography is absolutely beautiful at times, and they do a lot of callbacks. Music was like good at times, but also great at other moments.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I'm just gonna pass it along.
I'm not sure I can add on much more to that. That I agree with everything you just said. Yeah, cinematography was pretty stellar in this at all points, in all sections of it. Remember what was happening in the narrative. And soundtrack, I think, matched very well and added to a lot of the scenes. And I don't know, you guys can expand upon that, but yeah.
What I was gonna say about style is definitely it being a visual movie. It reminded me a lot when I was watching it of Martin Scorsese's Kundun, which is a 3-hour movie where there's like no English spoken. and it's very captivating. And something like Jarmusch's, where he just does a lot of visual stuff where you're following some around. This movie was really, really, really well handled on that, and it's one of these things where you have to see it because it is just all around. The style in this movie is just fantastic.
It is. It's a. I don't know if there's a shot in this movie I didn't like.
Yes. Well said, buddy.
And there are a great many shots that I really loved. When we were talking about the introduction earlier, I think that the introduction was absolutely beautifully shot, and like there are a lot of just landscape shots in the beginning of the movie. It's just a series of landscape shots at the beginning of the movie, and they're all freaking beautiful. Just terrific, awesome, like long shots of the Indian of like India, basically. That is all completely terrific. The soundtrack is wonderful. The music that goes with this movie is amazing, and on top of that, the just straight up sound design is really good. I remember a scene where there's a song playing and it kind of trails away to raindrops hitting a windshield, and that just hit me like holy like damn, that's an amazing, that's amazing in terms of sound design, like that specific part.
I agree with you.
All that is really great. And Chris, I'm gonna let you go. I'm gonna let you talk.
Oh no, I agree with you on the sound design. I definitely agree with you, all of you, on the music. It was fantastic. But one of the things, because you were talking about how beautiful the landscapes were, and they were gorgeous. But one of the little things I really like they handled was the world from his perspective. When he's a kid, and
good point.
He's
nice touch.
there with all the adults around him. You didn't always see their faces. You saw how, from his point of view, they would be pushing
the
him
massive
aside
bodies. Yeah, true.
It was just really, really well handled.
Yeah.
So I have a final thought on this, since none of you brought it up. It was the references to Bollywood cinema in this.
the little touches.
There were a couple of things, and
There
I'm probably missing a ton because I'm not like well versed in that genre. But they have one particular scene where it almost breaks out, like it has to feel like it's about to break out into a musical.
Yes.
When there's initial courtship between
across the street, dancing down the street.
And then in the next scene, I think it's the next scene after, they actually bring up Bollywood like dance numbers. So it's great. And there's also the thing I learned by while instead of watching the movie, I was surfing the web
during cringeworthy moments.
There was like they didn't have any kissing in here because it was a taboo in Indian cinema. Like it was a reference to that. So I'm sure there's a ton more that I'm missing, but still those like kind of nods I think really elevated the film, especially if you get them. Like
things like that and everything else you just said. I think it's probably the strongest, if not the strongest, one for this film.
Right,
because it was the style that actually propelled the story. Yeah. So yeah. And Steve-O, would you recommend this movie?
So, I would recommend this movie. I think that it's a good movie to check out. I would recommend it probably much less strongly than a lot of other Oscar movies this year. This is a very strong year, I think, especially compared to last year. I liked the movies last year. I loved the movies this year. And this one's probably middle of the pack this year, if not on the lower part of the pack. I liked it. And there's no reason you shouldn't see it. It's a very good movie, but there are certainly better movies this year.
I pretty much agree with that by and large. Yeah, it was a solid film, and you should see it. It deserves to be seen. Just that you're right. This year has a strong-ass field. Like, it's pretty rock solid.
Strong-ass field.
Yes, thank you. So within that, like, yeah, it's just that there's probably maybe the upper third of the noms this year are probably beyond this, but Lion was a good film, a very goddamn solid film. So yeah, see it. It's just that it isn't as good as the others, but not to say it isn't a good film unto itself.
I'm kind of torn about this. Because
I knew you would be.
I didn't dislike this film. In fact, I enjoyed watching it, even though I was critical of it. if you ask me, is this the Oscar movie I should see this year? By no means. But you guys are about that.
Yeah.
Is this the Dev Patel Indian cinema film you should watch? No, watch Slumdog Millionaire. I think that's a better. I think Slumdog Millionaire is by far a better film than Lion.
I don't know, but by far, but probably on surface, yeah, I would agree with that.
By a couple points on the MOTS scale.
Okay, sure.
So I don't know if someone asked me, should I watch it? I'm like, yeah, why not? But I don't think that's actual. I wouldn't go out of my way to recommend this to anyone. And that might mean it's getting a 0.
I may just change just because I've invented my own scale for this very for this specific question. Would I see it again? I don't know if I would. It's a difficult one now in light of that. And because we said the strength of the field this year specifically, I'll keep it a soft 1, in fact. Okay. But I wouldn't see this film again. But again, not to say it's bad or mishandled in any way. Just that this field is better than it might have been on other years. I
thought when we went into this film, I thought that the him as a child was only going to be 15 minutes or half an hour. Turned out to be I think it's actually about close to 40%.
The first third of the film.
Yeah. But I love films that are shot the way they are. So I would wholeheartedly recommend this. But I would see it again. But my motivation for seeing it again would be to watch the beginning and the end, because as we said, the body was weak, weaker than the other two. But I love the introduction. I love the first third of this movie so much, and I thought what was contained even in the weaker parts, didn't.
Still kept it afloat.
Yeah, and I was propelled. I really wanted to see how his whole journey played out.
I got you.
So, I'm definitely giving it a strong 1. Okay, well, Ian?
All right, so time for the scores. Chris and Steve-O gave it the highest score with an 8. Scott gave it the middle score with a 7, and curmudgeonly old Ian, as usual, gives it a 6, which gives aggregate score of a 7.25, which again is an slightly above average film.
It's very solid film. Don't get me wrong. Just again, it's if not unfortunate, just the fact that the field this year is very strong. So this one, measured against the others, just isn't as good.
Well, if we rated more on style, this film would be ranked higher.
Right. But because we focus on narrative,
and I don't think it's the strongest narrative film I've seen by far this year.
And I would agree.
So, I agree.
Well, I guess that's it. And my name is Chris Morgan, and I don't give a flying fuck what the Oscars say. So I definitely recommend seeing this. So I've been here with Ian Manzer.
One Night in Calcutta.
And I'm here with Stephen Ormosi.
The Oscars also say watch this.
And Scott Thurlow.
And I'll take a train to be Northern myself. Good night.
Good night.
Editing and engineering by Christopher Morgan. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.